You know, I've lived long enough to witness political tempests come and go, but every so often, this country is confronted with a moment that tells you quietly at first and then unmistakably that we've crossed a threshold. What unfolded between President Trump and Congresswoman Ilhan Omar wasn't just another online quarrel or another 24-hour controversy. It was something far deeper. It was a cultural inflection point. Most Americans may not articulate exactly what they saw, but they felt it. They sensed instinctively that we are being pushed to redefine loyalty, citizenship, and the very essence of what it means to be American. And the spark was an act of cruelty so jarring that even those numb to modern politics stopped in their tracks. While a family was grieving a husband and father, Omar chose mockery, not criticism, not political disagreement, mockery. In my lifetime studying American politics, I've seen every form of rhetorical combat, but I have rarely seen anything descend into such moral darkness. When you ridicule a man's death while his children are still trying to understand why their father is gone, you reveal something about your character that no press release or carefully scripted clarification can conceal. And Americans recognize that instantly. Democrats, Republicans, independents, even those who barely follow politics reacted the same way. Because for generations we have shared one unwritten rule: you do not desecrate death. You leave mourning families alone. That was once a bipartisan instinct, part of the moral fabric that held this country together. So the backlash came quickly, and here is what made it extraordinary. It wasn't the usual partisan theater. It was ordinary Americans saying, no, this is not who we are. Many even began questioning whether someone who behaves with such contempt for the country's moral norms should continue enjoying the privileges that come from being welcomed here in the first place. And this is where Donald Trump demonstrated a political instinct that very few leaders possess. A conventional politician would have issued a tepid condemnation, offered the obligatory prayers, and tried to move on. But Trump understood almost intuitively that something larger was at stake. He recognized that Omar's cruelty did not merely offend people, it exposed a festering debate about allegiance, gratitude, and the fragility of national cohesion. And so he reframed the debate entirely. He didn't simply say Omar was wrong. He contrasted America, flawed, certainly, but functional, prosperous, and comparatively stable, with Somalia, a nation shattered by decades of civil war and corruption. And then he asked the question that polite society in Washington has long avoided: how does someone who fled a failed state presume to lecture Americans on how to maintain a successful one? That was the pivot. That was the moment the ground moved. The issue was no longer Trump versus Omar. It became something far more elemental: gratitude versus grievance, loyalty versus resentment, home versus adopted home. And Trump pressed the point further. He recounted meeting Somalia's president and joking, though not entirely joking, that perhaps Somalia might like Omar back. According to Trump, the answer was blunt: I don't want her. The remark was sharp, yes, but it was also philosophical. It forced Americans to confront a question we have avoided for decades. What happens when someone who was granted refuge and opportunity responds not with gratitude, but with mockery and contempt? And then Trump did something else, something the media had worked tirelessly to prevent. He dragged several long circulating allegations about Omar's immigration history out of the shadows and into the national spotlight. When a former president places a taboo topic on a public platform, it can no longer be dismissed as fringe speculation. It becomes a legitimate national conversation. Omar responded with confidence at first. She insisted that she could not be deported because she was a citizen. Technically, that is often true, but it is not absolute. Few Americans know that the United States maintains a lawful process denaturalization that allows the government to revoke citizenship obtained through fraud or deception. Most democracies maintain such a mechanism. Ours is no different. It is rare, yes, but it exists for a reason, because citizenship is not merely paperwork. It is a covenant. And suddenly, millions of Americans were asking questions they hadn't asked in generations. If someone violates that covenant, what happens next? Those of us who grew up during the Cold War remember a time when citizenship wasn't assumed to be unconditional, when loyalty mattered, when national allegiance wasn't a punchline but a requirement. And that collective memory, still alive in the older generations, is why Trump's reframing hit with such force. And that is when the political tide truly shifted. Omar, long protected by her party and her media allies, found herself completely exposed. When she appeared across from CNN's Caitlin Collins, she did not look like the defiant progressive icon her supporters were accustomed to. She looked rattled, defensive, at moments almost frightened. Collins pressed her on the grotesque Frankenstein meme, a post designed to humiliate and dehumanize the dead. Omar attempted to distance herself from the explicit language in the meme, but the image itself was the message, and she had shared it willingly. Then came the moment that revealed her fear. When Collins asked about growing calls for deportation, Omar snapped, blurting out, "You can't deport an American citizen." The words were meant to project confidence, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. When a politician abandons argument in favor of insult, calling dissenters idiots, it tells you something. In my decade studying politics, I've found that ad hominem attacks are not displays of strength but confessions of weakness. And the public, more perceptive than elites acknowledge, can detect fear. But perhaps the most revealing part of this entire episode was not Omar's reaction, it was the sudden silence of her allies. Normally, when members of the progressive wing face criticism, the response is instantaneous. Statements of solidarity, coordinated messaging, fundraising, blasts. But this time, nothing. Donors hesitated. Operatives whispered about primary challenges. When your own side goes quiet, it means they've calculated that defending you is more costly than abandoning you. And the contrast that followed was devastating. While Omar mocked the dead, Donald Trump stood shoulder to shoulder with Charlie Kirk's grieving family at a memorial attended by tens of thousands. The vice president was there, prominent conservatives were there, but more importantly, ordinary Americans were there, people of every background, and the visual contrast was unmistakable. This is dignity, this is respect, this is the America we once celebrated. And while families mourned, an armed individual impersonating law enforcement approached the memorial grounds, another grim reminder of what reckless rhetoric unleashes in the real world. When leaders normalize cruelty, unstable minds interpret it as permission. History offers countless warnings about societies that disintegrate not because of external threats, but because they degrade their own moral fabric from within. This moment was never just about Ilhan Omar. It was about two competing visions for America. On one side stands the progressive model. Omar represents a worldview defined by grievance, obsessed with America's sins, eager to redefine national identity through ideological reengineering. To her supporters, this is progress. To her critics, it is a repudiation of the American experiment. On the other side stands Donald Trump, representing a form of civic nationalism rooted in gratitude, cohesion, and unapologetic patriotism. Trump does not view America as a problem to be solved. He views it as a civilization to be defended. And for those who lived through World War II, the Cold War, or even the upheavals of the 1,970 seconds, that distinction resonates deeply, because you remember a time when unity was essential, not optional. Many of you recall in America where pulling together was simply what citizens did. Patriotism wasn't mocked, it wasn't controversial, it was normal. And that memory, your memory, is why this moment struck such a nerve, because you've seen what happens when nations lose their shared identity. You've studied or you've lived through what it looks like when loyalty becomes negotiable. And so you recognize the danger long before younger generations even understood what they were seeing. But Omar's isolation also exposed something more troubling: the erosion of responsibility in our political class, the normalization of outrage, the transformation of cruelty into currency. At the memorial, an armed impersonator of law enforcement was discovered roaming the grounds. Think about that. A gathering meant for mourning, nearly infiltrated by someone who could have caused catastrophic harm. That is where unchecked rhetoric leads. Leaders inflame the public square, extremists interpret it as a signal, and the guardrails that keep society intact begin to crack. This is the cycle we now face. Outrage generates attention, attention generates money, money fuels more outrage. But where does that road take us? Free speech is essential, but responsible speech is indispensable. Leaders must know the difference. Omar exercised her right, Trump exercised leadership, and America recognized the distinction. Character scandals, I've often said, destroy political careers more effectively than policy scandals ever will. You can recover from an unpopular vote, you cannot recover from appearing indecent, and mocking the dead crosses a line few voters will forgive. From this point forward, every opponent she faces will remind the public of this moment, and they will not be wrong to do so. Because leadership is more than ideology, it is character. Trump understood that Omar's cruelty reopened a deeper question, not simply whether she should apologize, but whether she ever honored the covenant of citizenship to begin with. Whether denaturalization, an obscure legal process, should be part of the public debate. Most Americans had never heard the term before last week. They know it now. And once trust is broken at that foundational level, it rarely returns. Omar didn't merely alienate critics, she rattled her own party, and the silence from her allies speaks volumes. But let me be clear, this moment isn't ultimately about Ilhan Omar. It is about the American character, who we are, who we were, and who we may yet become. We now stand at a crossroads. Do we reward leaders who choose cruelty over decency? Do we normalize the mockery of the dead? Do we accept division as our new civic identity? Or do we demand something better? Do we insist that our leaders understand the weight of their words? Your generation remembers a country that valued responsibility, that exercised restraint, that understood public service as a privilege. You remember the America that showed up at funerals, that comforted the grieving, that honored the fallen. And that memory gives you the moral authority to insist we return to it. Because the danger isn't merely that Omar behaved cruelly. The danger is that we may be constructing a political system that rewards her for it, where outrage replaces wisdom and cruelty becomes the fastest path to power. But the contrast at that memorial gave me hope. Tens of thousands gathered to honor a life. Americans of every political persuasion came together in shared grief. That moment, not the outrage, not the mockery, was the real America. And that tells me something important. Despite all the division, we still share a moral core. We still recoil from indecency. We still expect our leaders to behave with dignity. Trump's response wasn't merely political. It was moral. He honored the grieving. He defended American values. He reminded us of what leadership once meant and could mean again. Omar's downfall, by contrast, illustrates what happens when leaders forget those values, when politics becomes performance, when cruelty becomes routine. This moment reveals something profound about the state of our country. It revealed how fragile our civic norms have become, but also how deeply they still matter to ordinary Americans. And that responsibility to defend those norms belongs to all of us. So I'd like to hear your perspective. Did Trump fundamentally reshape the political landscape with this moment? Should Omar face meaningful consequences for crossing a moral line? Should someone who mocks the dead still represent this nation, or has she forfeited that privilege? Let me know your thoughts below. And if this analysis offered something worth considering, feel free to share it, because most Americans still don't grasp what this moment truly means for our future.